I'm Stephanie Norby, and I'm the director of the Smithsonian Center for Learning Digital Access, and I want to thank all of you for coming. We're able to offer museum fellows because of the generosity of the Women's Committee, which a number of years ago created an endowment that allowed the Smithsonian to invite visiting scholars to come here so that we could have conversations about issues that are relevant to the museum field. And in this case, because there's so much interest about digitization, we're privileged to have Romilly here, who is looking at how do you use all this digital content for the purposes of fundraising. So I'd like to just tell you a little bit about Romilly, and then I'm going to turn it over to her presentation. She's currently a fellow in museum practice here, and she has been here for 6 months researching the use of digitized collections to engage museum donors. This includes a comparison of philanthropy between the U.S. and the UK, which is Romilly's home. And Romilly works as a consultant working with museums, especially small museums, to think about how they can raise funding to support their work and how they do that now in a digital world. She's led a 4-year program in the UK working with the heritage sector to develop a culture of fundraising. And she's also been a researcher with a social policy think tank in Canada and worked in the UK with the local government sector in lobbying, policy development, and sector improvement roles. I've had a chance to have a number of conversations with Romilly just to talk about how the landscape for fundraising has changed in both the UK and US as we have to look for other sources and government funding as we move forward. She has academic achievements include a master's degree in international political economy and a bachelor's degree in economics and politics, both from the University of Warwick, and a postgraduate diploma in local government management from the Warwick Business School.
So before I became a fellow here, I was running a 4-year programme with museums in the UK. It was called Inspiring a Culture of Philanthropy, and it ran from 2014 to 2018. It predominantly worked with museums in the southeast of England and the Hampshire region. And the aim of the project was to help museums to develop their fundraising capacity. So that was a mixture of building their skills and sharing that across the whole organisation, and also reaching out to donors and raising their profile with donors of the heritage sector. At the end of the project, the evaluation report highlighted that museums had made a lot of progress and there were some great success stories. However, the time that they needed to engage with donors and build those relationships was still a barrier for many of them. And finding solutions to fundraising that would make it easier for them, or using things that already existed in a slightly different way, was one of the recommendations. One of the other things that came out through the project, and one of the reasons that the project was set up actually, was the government's interest in the UK cultural sector looking for other forms of funding other than government funding, which had predominantly been the main source. And one of the things that they were quite keen to look at was the US model of philanthropic giving, and how that could in some way be replicated in the UK. So while the project ended in 2018, I was still keen to look at some of these challenges and these questions. At the same time, although the project had finished, those museums that I worked with, they were continuing to meet as part of a peer learning group. And so when this fellowship came up as an opportunity, it felt like it was a good way for me to still be able to support that group and be able to make use of the fantastic wealth of resources at the Smithsonian, which I now found on my doorstep, which is brilliant. So through this research, I'm going to be sharing my findings with museums in the south of England, and we have a website called the Fundraising Portal, so the reports, presentations, hopefully the recording from today will also go on there as well. Of course I'll be sharing the report with Gilda, and I can make sure that you all see a copy of that too. So the main focus was really to look at how the overlap between digitized objects and donor engagement and that kind of filled in between. So to shine a light really on where that overlap existed. And then through a series of desk research and interviews, I wanted to develop a better understanding of donor behaviour, particularly the changes that are occurring around this at the moment. And I was also looking at digital fundraising and museum digitisation to understand what the main topics of focus are within those areas, and also some of the challenges. But in looking at both of those areas, really that overlap between the two was my focus. I also wanted to look at the culture of giving in the US and in the UK, the changes that are occurring around giving, and see what the UK can learn from the US in particular. I also wanted to be able to collect some examples where digital objects were being used. So I collected examples from the Smithsonian and also some other organisations. My objective within that really was to be able to share good practice examples on the topic with others, and to be able to use that to spread people's understanding of how digitised objects could be used to support fundraising. Then the final two objectives, I wanted to provide an evidence base really which could be used, so involving statistics, social data and examples, which museums could use either through their leadership teams or through fundraisers having conversations within museums, and using that evidence to be able to have those conversations about how digital objects could be used in this way. First of all, as I was saying, to me the focus is this intersection where digitised objects can be used to engage donors. So I just want to kind of explain what I mean by that. So I see this as an intersection and overlap between museum digitisation and digital fundraising. Before I started my research and as I carried it out, I found that this was a topic that hadn't really been included in either field of practice in much detail. In some ways, it can be seen that by fundraisers that this is just another tool that can be used as part of digital fundraising, and I would agree with that. If museums already have digital objects, then this could be a very simple progression for them to use this within their fundraising as well. Sometimes identifying simple changes or seeing things from a different perspective can have a big impact. And I hope that my research also shines a light on this area for fundraisers and also for curators and digitisation professionals, to help them to see that object digitisation can be used within fundraising as well. Museum fundraisers have a wealth of powerful visual images at their disposal, which can be used to tell a story or really add to the museum story as well. Digitisation professionals also need to be aware of this opportunity and make sure that there is useful metadata with objects that comes with their objects, and also highlight specific objects to fundraising teams which could be useful in that capacity. One of the other things I just wanted to clarify as well is that this topic isn't about how you can use digitised objects in a monetary way, so it's not about using digitised objects to sell them in any commercial context. And also the focus of my research hasn't been around how you fund digitisation itself. Of course, sometimes fundraising projects will involve that as well, but I haven't looked specifically at that. Just going through the three main areas where I have collected data. Looking at donor behaviour. So there's a shift among many donors, often younger, but not exclusively, towards a model of giving which means that there's greater involvement in the organisation they're funding. This is so-called democratization of philanthropy. It's seen across different levels of giving, but it's most noticeable in younger philanthropists who have a significant amount to give. They're shifting their attention from specific organisations to causes instead, and focus on the impact that their investment will have. They want to see results and will fund where their donations will make the most difference. This younger group of donors have grown up as digital natives and they expect to be able to engage online. Their experiences online mean that they want to have a personalised and interactive experience with the organisation when they're approached digitally. Using digitised objects to create personal collections, use objects to make, for example, a calendar or a bookmark, or vote for their favourite objects can help to engage these individuals as donors. And then, in addition to that, making it easy for them to follow that next step to giving, alongside, obviously, a compelling case and a story around the audience, around the museum, can help to engage that audience and convert them to donors. This so-called next gen or next generation of donors are important, as it's estimated that over the next few decades, around $30 trillion will pass from the baby boom generation to their children, in the largest wealth transfer that's ever taken place. This, combined with younger philanthropists, mainly from the tech industry, means finding new ways to attract attention, tell a story, and build a personal relationship will be even more important for fundraisers. So just moving on to some of the ways in which digital fundraising is of relevance to this topic. In 2017, 95% of people in the UK and 87% in the US used the internet. People expect to be connected to others online and expect to be contacted through email and social media. Blackboard's benchmark report showed that since 2016, online giving has grown 17%, and average online gift amounts have continued to rise. In the UK, the 2018 Giving Survey showed that 19% of respondents gave to charity online. 58% of those gave via the web platform Just Giving, and 46% gave through a charity's website, and 14% gave through social media, such as Facebook. There's a growing trend to give through social media platforms like Facebook and Instagram, which are increasingly making this a much easier process for donors as well. In many of the interviews that I conducted, people said that telling a consistent story about the museum is vital, and that the message needs to be the same across all digital platforms, because obviously people don't just visit one of these. Social media also gives museums an opportunity to engage with potential donors one-to-one without having to meet in person, something that may have previously only been reserved for their high net worth donors. This can be appealing to both donors and fundraisers to help build a rapport. And as I'll show you with the examples later on in my presentation, digitised collections can be tailored to particular interest and easily sent to that person. And it makes it an easy link to, if you have an easy link on your donation page to then allow people to give, that again can help translate those audiences into donors. So any opportunity as well for potential donors to play or engage will help to increase those donations, as the Office of Advancement here has discovered. I just wanted to include an example here of where social media was used. This is the Museum of English Rural Life, which is in Reading in England, so not too far from the area that I was working in. And they have made use of one of their digitised images, together with some simple text. This image went viral. Since then, they've had another 2 of their images that have gone viral on Twitter. The impact of this, so wider than the Twitter sphere, has been that it has increased their donor numbers. People have visited the museum specifically interested in this area, both domestic and international visitors. They've seen increased sales in their shops, and their donations have also increased. So it's an example really of something quite simple, but where museums can make use of the most fantastic asset that they have, which is their collections, and can help them to find their own unique voice online in what is becoming a crowded arena. The final point that I just wanted to make on digital fundraising is about the fast change in pace of digital. So digital technology is changing all the time, and obviously the cost around this can be quite prohibitive for a lot of organisations. Put together with the skills that are needed to do this, it can be more than some museums can afford. So the message that I wanted to give here really is about making sure that the tools that are used are appropriate, and just using a couple very effectively can be much more useful than always trying to keep up with the latest technology. So moving on to look at the other sphere of museum digitisation. The main reasons, mostly that museums digitise their collections, has largely to date been driven by conservation priorities, as well as increasing access to their collections for research and education. The Smithsonian has a strategic aim of reaching 1 billion people a year with a digital-first strategy. This has promoted moving in time to open access and a policy of mass digitisation. Other museums that I spoke to have preferred a collections-based digitisation approach, which might be funded by one particular donor with an interest in that field, or to meet particular priorities for that museum or that country. Whatever the reasons for digitising, it's really important to have good metadata to accompany the objects. This was a point that was made many times during the interviews that I conducted. This will help all kinds of users to make better sense of the objects. Thinking about the most appropriate form of digitisation is also an important consideration. You need to think about the purpose and the users. A recent example of 3D scanning was used for the hatch door of the Apollo 11 command module at the Smithsonian. It was reconstructed using 3D print models, and it was then put back together live in front of museum visitors. The 3D scan can also be accessed online to allow online audiences to engage as well. And this is a really great example where 3D gives an extra element to users and allows those that can engage in person and also online to feel that they are part of the experience. However, it isn't always 3D that museums should strive for. 2D photographs, scans, videos, audio can also be effective ways of achieving the same ends. I'd also like to make a point here about the importance of taking a whole systems approach when it comes to digital. A UK research project called One by One is looking at the workforce needs in the sector to be able to succeed with digital cultural activity in the future. They say that a whole systems approach is needed when digital skills are not held, so that they're not held by just a few within an organisation. And it's something that everybody in an organisation needs to be able to understand from the leadership down. This obviously is a longer term challenge, but I think it's important to address and highlight that as an important way forward. So one of the other main areas that I was keen to look at in my research was the comparison of the UK and the US in terms of their culture of giving. The UK cultural sector is often told that it should model its fundraising practices on the US model of giving. I wanted to explore if this was possible and highlight where the differences and similarities might be. So first of all, they have very different origins. UK giving started predominantly through religious groups, churches, and by the time wealthy industrial philanthropists emerged in the 19th century, there were already quite clear ideas about where people should give and what were considered worthy causes. In the US, by contrast, philanthropists in the 19th century often emerged to address issues which either the state hadn't evolved at that point to address, or where the state felt it was not its role to take. Taxation laws in the US as well have encouraged donors at all levels to give. And by the mid-20th century, giving was an established American value. This hasn't happened in the UK. This sense of a responsibility of giving, being part of your role as a citizen. In the UK, parts of the non-profit sector still need to make the argument of why should people give, why does the state not already fund this? And that's a barrier that many museums and heritage sector organisations have faced. So while the UK absolutely can learn fundraising methods from the US, I think it's important still to recognise that the culture of giving is very different, and it's obviously not realistic to expect that culture of a society to change. I also wanted to highlight on here the culture is digital. This was or is a paper that was produced by the British government last year, and it's in response to the Culture White Paper, which was produced by government in 2016. And it sets out a number of commitments that the government have to creating and supporting the creation of more digital within the cultural sector. So they've set up digital champions, they have a digital task force, and there'll be a digital cultural code which will be launched later this year. So this is all ways of encouraging the sector to consider digital and the opportunities for it. Although I would just note, as I did at the beginning, that fundraising actually wasn't one of the things that was covered within this. So again, kind of the separation of those two areas largely still exists. I'd now like to move on to some examples that I've collected through my research. So just for those that aren't familiar with the Smithsonian Learning Lab, most people around here probably are, but it's an online platform to access all the digital objects from across the institution, and it then allows users to create content with online tools and share these and create their own collections. And they can also be easily embedded into other web pages. The Learning Lab tool as well allows the creation of collections around a particular theme, or can even be personalised to an individual's interest. It can be used to co-create, so you can bring objects together which might not be within the same physical space. So this is an ideal platform for digitised objects to be used in fundraising, and something that the Smithsonian Office of Advancement has used. Some examples where they've made use of this. They've used it in emails, so they've used their mailing list to send out things around Valentine's Day, for example, which was the first time it was used in 2017. And they used a Western Union style telegram, which could be pulled out and sent as an e-card, and then this led you onto the donation page. And through this, they were successful in raising $6,000 in one day, which is great. They've also used it for things like Valentine's Day and even for the Super Bowl. So they created an example of Super Bowls, which is quite nice. And then after using collections in emails, they have found that there's actually a significant increase in donations. So of these, 60% were new donors. And the other thing that they noted is on their email list that they use for digital fundraising, 30% of these people have never actually visited the Smithsonian Institution, and of those, 30% actually never plan to visit. However, they are still engaged through the digital means, and obviously the digital objects are a way to bridge that physical to them wherever they might be. Some other examples where the Smithsonian has made use of digitised objects in this way is through Kickstarter campaigns. So the first of these was in 2015 with Reboot the Suit, which was to fund preservation work and also 3D scanning of Neil Armstrong's spacesuit. So the fundraising target for that was $500,000. This was exceeded, and it currently stands at $719,000, which is fantastic. So with that funding, they were able to reach their goal and achieve those ends, but also they've kept increasing this total, and it's now moving on to fund other work. So the plan is to digitize Alan Shepard's spacesuit as well, and this will be added to the display that's being created at the Air and Space Museum. Another one of the Kickstarter campaigns was Keep Them Ruby, which was to fund preservation work of the ruby slippers from The Wizard of Oz. So the target for that was $300,000, and they raised $385,000. Although it is worth noting on this campaign that it was slightly more expensive than you would expect ordinarily. So the target is usually around 35 cents to the dollar for a campaign. This one was 38 cents. But through the interviews that I did around this, the comments came back that actually, although it was more time consuming than perhaps a simpler digital campaign would be, it brought together different parts of the organisation. So coming back to that idea of a whole systems approach, it meant that different disciplines, different professions worked together to enable this to happen. Now, obviously, both of these are very iconic images, and images in themselves create emotions and can bring about a very strong connection for donors as well. So I think using these images has definitely helped in those campaigns. The Cooper Hewitt, which is the Smithsonian Design Museum based in New York, they've also used digital very successfully. So the museum closed for a large refurbishment, and during that time they had a donor which funded the digitization of their entire collection, which is 200,000 objects. These are now all available online on their site. As part of this, the refurbishment of the museum, when it reopened, they were very keen that digital became part of that experience for their physical visitors as well. So one of the things that was funded through venture philanthropy funding was something called the pen. Now this is quite a large chunky pen that you are given as you enter the museum, and through a series of digital displays as you move around the museum, you can select particular items and create your own digital collection as well. So after you've finished your physical experience, you then have this digital collection to access as well, and you can send that to others, share that online. Of course, you could also use that within a fundraising context. So somebody working at the museum could create a small curated collection using that technology and share that with potential donors as well. So having those digitised items has allowed them to use them in lots of different formats. I want to just cover a couple of non-Smithsonian examples that I've come across in my research. So the first of these is from George Washington University, the Textile Museum. The museum's over 100 years old and has an extensive collection which is very well regarded. However, at the moment, only about 5% of the collection are currently digitised, although recent funding means that hopefully that is going to increase soon. 40% of their visitors are actually from outside the local area, so having online access is really important for the museum. Back in 2013, they sent out high-resolution downloadable images from their collection, and these could be used as wallpaper on computers or as background on a smartphone. And recently they had a visitor to the museum who actually commented and showed them their phone with this background that they had still kept, which I think is another great example how an image can create that connection. and they said that they've continued to be reminded of the museum, and I think that's quite a simple action that has been very effective. And the final example that I wanted to cover is called the GIFT project. This is something that's been funded by EU funding, Horizon 2020 funding. It's involved 10 museums and universities from across Europe and the US. And it's looking at the concept of giving and what it means to give a gift. It's web-based, so it's not an app, so it doesn't need an app to be downloaded. And what takes place here is when a visitor visits a museum, they are given the link to a website, and in some ways similar to the pen idea, they can go around the museum and take photos of certain images. They can record audio onto their phone, and then that's packaged up as a gift, which can then be sent out to a particular individual. The idea behind this is that it's a very personal gift that you would be creating with a particular individual in mind. However, they've noted through the trialling that's taken place that people have used this in lots of different ways. So, for example, school groups have used this to create a scavenger hunt to take them around the museum, and they've also used it to give to people that they know are interested in a particular temporary collection but haven't been able to visit the museum to see it. So the curator has been able to develop a mini curation of that exhibition for them. The site's been developed by an organisation called Blast Theory, which is based in Brighton in the south of England. Brighton Museum is one of the museums that is currently trialling this approach, and they'll be doing that until October. The organisations involved will then produce a final research report about this work. The great thing about this as well is that it's all open source and it's freely available for people to access. So I was particularly interested in this, thinking about the smaller museums that I've worked with. It's something that doesn't require much upfront cost or technology for the museum itself. The main cost really is around marketing this to visitors and being able to explain how it works to the visitors in the museum. One of the aims of my research is to give the museum sector an evidence base to use to talk about this topic. It could be for peer-to-peer conversations or to help put a case together in a museum for a leadership team or fundraising team to talk about how they can use digitised objects. I've collected evidence, examples and lessons that have been learnt, and I'll be presenting these in much more detail in my research report. This will be shared with Skilda and also the South East Museum Development Programme, which supports museums in the south of England, and also the museums that were involved in the Inspiring the Culture of Philanthropy project. In addition to the research report, I also led a workshop in Hampshire in England over the summer. There were 10 representatives from the museums that I'd worked with through the project that attended this. And in that I was able to give them some of the initial findings from my research and also hear about some of their experiences of digitisation. To find out where their current challenges are and also where they've had opportunities to use this. So following on from that, colleagues here at Skilda, we've been able to have conversations with the museum in England about how they can make use of the Learning Lab and how they could use the platform to engage with audiences around the world and also potentially with donors as well. I really want my research to be the start of a conversation on this topic, where museums can explore the potential that this has to support their fundraising. It's also an opportunity to talk across museum disciplines, to encourage that whole approach to sharing the knowledge across different practitioners. And also a way of sharing examples and experiences with a wider audience. I'd really like to hear your thoughts on my research, and I think we've got some time now for us to do that. So I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have as well.
We had a funder who gave us a gift from his estate, and I went to visit him in a nursing home to talk to him about, to just visit with him and thank him. And he told me the reason he gave us the gift is every single Sunday he used to sit with his wife, who had since passed away, and sit on a particular park bench. And they would sit on this park bench in the garden. And that was that memory. So he didn't have children, he never did, but somehow he gave it to our office. But I could send him a collection that included an image of that park bench and other things in the garden, you know, just to, as a thank you. But I've been wondering the same thing about how do we do that with the stories of impact of what a teacher does with their children in the classroom, or we haven't used it in that way, so it made me wonder about that.
Yeah, and I think in terms of impact, there's kind of two sides to that. So there's impact in terms of examples like that, and being able to tell a story around those examples. And obviously, with the example that you gave, the image creates that emotion, that connection, that memory, which is so powerful. There's also impacts that you can measure, obviously, with digital. So I know the Learning Lab has fantastic statistics that you can draw on who's viewed which items, and funders, of course, want to have that information too. So I think using the digital allows you much more to kind of trace through and form kind of that evidence base of what's being used, what's accessed. And a bit like the Office of Advancement are able to come up with so many statistics around whether they're first-time donors, where they've given, at which point in the process they gave. So you can see, okay, which parts of this are actually having the most impact, and impact both in terms of users, but also impact on your donors.
Questions. With limited resources for digitization, did the sort of struggle to find the balance between what would make compelling fundraising cases and objects that would make us compelling fundraising stories versus what like researchers and conservators wanted to prioritize to digitize? Come on, I know you have to do this a lot in his office. Because those can be very different things.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think so it was interesting, one of the comments I made when I did my workshop in August, so the museums that I was speaking to there are very small, sometimes volunteer run, and I think they kind of felt, what can we learn from something so big as the Smithsonian? And I said, well actually, when you're as big as the Smithsonian is, I think sometimes challenges like that are actually larger than when you're in a small museum, where you might have a more limited collection, you only have one curator, and then a much smaller board, much smaller leadership. It's a lot easier to kind of make those decisions about prioritising what you digitise. But I think, yeah, the kind of decision around, okay, what is your reason for digitising? Is a challenging conversation to have sometimes. I think sometimes, so from some of the people that I spoke to, different organisations, sometimes that can be driven by a particular funder. So if you have a donor that really wants to fund, for example, the British Library, they have some Islamic texts that they have a particular funder that's going to fund the digitisation, that gets digitised. But at the same time, they also have priorities around preservation, and I know you have them around research needs as well. So it is a difficult balance, I think, sometimes, and obviously sometimes that will depend on where the funds are to fund a particular collection. I think when you're then thinking about, okay, what do we have digitised that we can draw on to tell a story of the museum to make use of in a fundraising context, there's definitely, you know, I know the Smithsonian, the percentage of what's already digitised is very low compared to the overall collection, but the images that are digitised, and I'm not sure if that was kind of conscious priority, or but the images that are digitized already provide a fantastic resource to draw on. And I think that's why I wanted to include the sheep in the presentation, that you kind of look at that and think on its own, just a picture of a sheep, but you can actually make use of that to kind of either tell a story or to just use it quite cleverly and simply. So you don't necessarily need to have everything digitized, and you don't necessarily need to think these are our most amazing treasures that we must put at the forefront. Sometimes it can be something that's a little bit quirky and obscure that has more impact.
You showed us how digitalization could engage donors, especially new donor, younger generation donors. In your research, have you looked into how digitalization or digitized content can actually move the donors up their giving level from just you and me signing a check or clicking $10 to actually becoming a major gift donor?
So I looked at how it helps to facilitate that engagement, how it helps to continue that engagement. So evidence around how from that initial engagement it can help to kind of maintain, and there's evidence around, so although last year, which was kind of maybe a bit of an outlier year in terms of giving in some ways, but in terms of kind of membership is actually going up and is quite a solid base for giving. So I think that's kind of, there's a positive there, but I don't have any evidence around whether that then helps to move them up to become more major donors.
If one thought I have, and that what I've seen a little bit, and I think it's going to be an advantage for institutions like the Smithsonian or other kind of more national systems or museums, and probably a disadvantage for more regional or local museums, is that, with becoming digital, what I see with the Smithsonian is that, so we were always an East Coast institution, kind of seen from other parts of the country, and people said, yeah, Smithsonian, but somewhat irrelevant for me being in San Francisco. Now that we have becoming digital, it becomes much more relevant for people in other parts of the country. So people starting to pay attention to what we do, and they say, I love this idea of getting things digitized, because now you're coming to me basically in San Francisco instead of I always had to come to the East Coast, and it was just, so I can see that as a driver, and I assume partially that's going to attract new donors. I think whether they're entry level or more major gift donors who say, I love the idea that Smithsonian is finally coming to the West Coast or wherever it is, even globally actually. I mean, because there was always, I've had multiple conversations over the years. People said, I would love the Smithsonian would send a big, kind of traveling exhibition around the world, which we would never do basically, but the draw was there clearly. So now that we finally can do that in some way, basically, I think it's going to have an impact, but it's going to also potentially weaken those more local museums that were catering to that. Anyway,
I think that links to the impact issue as well, which donors often look for, and that kind of your impact now isn't just those that can physically visit on the East Coast. That impact spreads globally, but absolutely across the whole country. And that's often a powerful driver for donors is impact. But I think the point about kind of how the impact of digital on smaller museums, again, that was one of the concerns that some of the museums I spoke to in the UK were worried about, was actually if we digitise everything and put everything on there, what's the incentive for people to come and visit and pay an admission fee when they could just view all of this for free online? And evidence that I've collected actually is to the contrary, that people aren't discouraged from visiting. If anything, it will encourage visits. A physical experience is very different to viewing objects online. So, for example, Jane Austen House Museum, they've got a collection of 44 of their most treasured Jane's items on their website. Amazing collection. You know, some of those, so for example, written documents, you can get much closer to them online than you probably can physically in the museum. But you're not in Jane Austen's house. You're not walking the floorboards that she walked. So, you know, it's a very different physical experience to be there. But it also will entice people through seeing online, yes, okay, I could go and see these items if I visit. And particularly for an organisation like that, which has global interest, they've found that a real positive to have the digital. And yeah, I think that kind of encourages the physical visits as well.
It's not only at the Smithsonian, but with museums outside, you can cross boundaries. So, for instance, Philippa used to manage the Heritage Month programming, but a real challenge we had is we didn't have strong collections on some of the recent immigrant groups that we were doing programming for. But there are regional museums that do, and now we can partner with them to tell a fuller story about the United States and a more current story than we could based on our own collections. Or another example is we did a collection test worked with the Terracotta Warrior Museum. So Sackler-Freer has some collections from the first emperor, but it's not sufficient to really tell a story. But by pairing it with the Terracotta Warrior Museum, it raised the visibility of the Sackler-Freer and told a fuller story. And then it led to lots of discussions with people in the museum in China about how different American education is from education in China and how we had to think about presenting differently. And that helped them with tourism.
Yeah.
So the connections across, I don't know how to fundraise for it, but I know that it adds value and has an impact. But how we go about monetizing that, I don't know.
Yeah, and I think that's that kind of impact of, again, looking at your data that you collect around, okay, who has visited this, who has accessed it, and where are they? So are they in China, are they in the US? I was just thinking about the conversation we had with the Diving Museum yesterday.
Yeah.
So kind of a similar idea, because it would be bringing together their digitized objects with some from Smithsonian, and by doing that, telling not just the diving story, but being able to join that with the space story.
Yeah.
It would create a much richer story to tell. And I suppose from a donor perspective, it's that added impact that you're getting as a result of that. So donors are obviously always keen on impact and partnership as well. So if you're working with a partner which allows you to leverage something from your object that you wouldn't have done individually, there's definitely value in that as well. But I think, yeah, the evidence around that is harder, I suppose, in terms of kind of statistics. There's certain things you can do, but some of that will be case studies, stories.
I think it's less than 1% of our millions of collections that have actually been used by someone to make a collection. And to Lindsay's question, it would be really interesting to analyze. We know once it's used in a collection, it's more often to be copied in another collection. But to figure out what are the characteristics, why are those things more interesting than others, would really be useful.
Yeah.
Because right now, education really isn't a factor into making these decisions.
Yeah, and obviously with mass digitization, it's just about the numbers in some ways. And so by having that kind of mass, which is great that there's been so many objects that are digitized, but having the metadata to accompany that is such a large task as well. I don't know how the digitization program office kind of.
Sorry, I missed.
Sorry,
I was thanking her for raising the issue of metadata, because that's always an issue for us. If half the metadata people can't use it, but my sense is it's a hard thing to tackle because there's no one office that owns it. Everybody contributes to it, but it's really hard to figure out how to address it because everybody does it differently, and then you have the registrar doing some, the curator doing some, so the digitization, but everybody's doing their piece of the information, not the whole.
Yeah, my understanding is that we have high expectations of artificial intelligence to help us with that. I know that that's the case with going open access. When we're going to put all of that out there, that eventually we'll need that basically to make sense of all the metadata, because it is so diverse and it's not standardized basically to kind of, because manually it's just not possible once you're in the billions.